this is the moment you've all been waiting for. It's the last baseball game on the Famicom. After 50 games, 9 of which were Family Stadium games, we're finally at an ending. But before I dive into baseball, December 1st also brought another big moment for the Famicom. There was a hardware refresh. Okay, Sharp had released a few variants on the Famicom already, most notably their televisions, and the Famicom Twin, which integrated the disk system with the original Famicom. But Nintendo themselves had stuck by their design for almost 10 years, with the only difference from the original launch model was changing out the horrible, failure-prone square buttons for the round ones that everyone was familiar with. The AV Famicom got that name from the giant AV label on the front of the box. The redesign made the controllers detachable instead of hardwired, and this had the effect of eliminating the Player 2 microphone. The most important change was that it modified the Famicom to use the same cable for connecting to televisions as the Super Famicom. Previously, the Famicom only did RF or radio frequency out, which basically created the same kind of signal as a broadcast TV station, and then ran that through a single cable. This kind of connection was prone to interference, and so you often got a fuzzy, staticky picture. The AV Famicom used composite video. That broke the audio and visual signals out to separate lines, and it might not have been the highest quality picture available, but it was still a big step up from the original Famicom. Ironically, in the US, the same style of redesign for the Nintendo Entertainment System eliminated the AV video out and made it RF only. I've been using an unmodified AV Famicom to record all of Famidaily, so it's finally my hardware's time to shine. Nintendo published their own take on baseball very early in the Famicom's life. That was a big hit, and for a long time no one would take Nintendo on directly. 2 years later, Namco releases Pro Yaku Family Stadium, and it basically lays out exactly what baseball games would be going forward. They even re-released the game a few months later with a few stat changes. While Nintendo's baseball was big, Family Stadium was huge. And virtually every baseball game going forward would just copy Family Stadium. There were a few that broke the mold though, like ASCII's Best Play Pro Yaku series, which took a statistical and strategic direction for the game. And there were games around baseball, like Capcom's Pro Yaku Satsujin Jiken, which was a murder mystery adventure game that happened to have a baseball theme. Baseball on the Famicom benefited from there being a huge baseball boom in Japan at the time, and that seemed to peak in 1989 when 10% of all games released on the Famicom that year were baseball games. Famista '94 isn't just the last baseball game, this is also the final Famicom game by Namco. Namco was the single most prolific publisher on the Famicom, with 84 games on the system. 86 if you want to count their recently released Famicom ports of Ga Plus and Pac-Man Championship Edition. Namco was already the biggest name in arcades when the Famicom was released, and their early days on the system were mainly porting over some of their hits. Several of Namco's Famicom releases were so influential that they shifted the entire course of the industry. Xevious defined what shoot-em-ups would be. Scrolling stages, 2 forms of attack, and a boss at the end. Juraga no To was a game that had everybody talking, and there wasn't an action-adventure game in the first 5 years of the Famicom's life that wasn't borrowing heavily from it. Pac-Land might have been a bad port, but as the first side-scrolling platformer, it laid out a course for the Famicom's most significant genre. And of course, there was Family Stadium. Namco was absurdly prolific during the early years of the Famicom, and there's hardly a genre that they didn't dip their toes into. However, Namco's relationship with Nintendo was rocky at best. When Namco's original 5-year license to publish games on the Famicom expired, they all but pulled out from the system. Instead, they went all in on the PC Engine, and they released a lot of classic games there, while the Famicom received just a few sparse releases. Which takes me back to Famista '94. The series has been running on fumes for several years now, having modes and features stripped out with yearly releases. And Famista 94 doesn't feel any different. It's effectively the exact same game as Famista 93, which was effectively the exact same game as Famista 92, which was pretty much the same game as Famista 91. The big new feature this year is an aquatic stadium, where you can apparently hit home runs into the aquarium and have fireworks shoot off there. Yeah, I don't know how that one works. As before, there's modes for playing one-off games, and a kind of pennant, kind of series mode, where you have to beat every team. Also carried over from the previous game are the options, which let you shorten the game to fewer innings, and let you turn over control of the fielding to the computer. There's a password system for continuing the pennant mode, but it's a 6-digit password, and almost anything that you enter is a valid password. Seriously, I just punched in numbers here. As for how the game plays, well, it plays exactly like the previous Famista games. The Family Stadium series has been some of the better playing Famicom baseball games, so it's not like this is horrible, but after 9 games it's also just kinda there. Anybody who plays this is going to get exactly what they're expecting. No more, no less. Famista 94 is also the hardest Famicom baseball game to acquire. I paid about 2,500 yen for my copy, and you don't see copies come up very often. I couldn't find a whole lot of comments from Japanese Famicom fans talking about Famista 94. At this point, everyone was kind of off the series. The third Super Famista game would be released a few months later, and I think that's where all the players were at this point. The Famista series would keep slugging away for a few more years. It didn't make the jump to the CD consoles, though, and the last yearly entry was in '97 for the Nintendo 64. But the series got revived in the 2000s, and there's been another Famista game every few years since then. My own take on Famista 94 is, it's a baseball game. After 50 of these, it's really hard to come up with anything to say unless the game is really awful or really spectacular. And Famista 94 is neither. It's just there. You could swap this cartridge for Famista 92, and you'd never know the difference. In fact, in this last shot, I've been playing Famista 92 and you didn't notice the difference. They weren't going to put in any serious effort to make Famista 94 a big blowout, a grand ending for one of the Famicom's most populous genres. It's just there.